So I thought we would take it in a slow, in a reflective kind of pace, because 6 years ago, Groundswell was 450 regenerative farmers in a shed. And 6 years later, it is over 5,000 people, which says a lot, I think. And I think that it would be quite a cool thing to tie up the 2 days, to look at where we've been, where we are, where we're going, because I think both our books are quite reflective in that sense. So for those who don't know, I'm Sarah Langford. I've written a book called Rooted, Stories of Land, Life and a Farming Revolution. I was a criminal and family barrister for 10 years, and I ended up in Suffolk kind of by accident, not really planning on leaving my urban life, and found myself with 2 very small children, looking after my husband's small farm, working out what we could do with it, working out whether there really was a future in British agriculture, because we became farmers by accidentally at one of the biggest crossroads that agriculture has seen in multiple generations. Subsidies were going. 84% of the population lived in urban areas. Farmers were on the top 10 hit list of environmental targets. 1 in every 3 Guardian article told me that farmers were the cause of most of the evils in the world. And I thought, where do we go from here? So I went off and looked at lots of farms all over the countryside and talked to as many people as I could, mostly those I tried to find without social media followings or consultancy businesses, people who were just getting on with it quietly. And Rooted is the story of that, coupled with the story of what we've done on our farm, coupled with, I suppose, my own maternal side story. My grandfather was a post-war farmer in Hampshire, never owned his own land, and yet he was absolutely sure of his place in the world, which was a hero. He fed a starving nation after war by growing as much food as he could, using as many chemicals and machines as he could. My uncle, Charlie, who took over the farm, thought that that's the job that he was being given. And then the goalposts shifted dramatically. And so part of Rooted, and part of, I suppose, the question I have is how we went from hero to villain in such an extremely short period of time, and where we're going next. And so that is Rooted. And maybe Jake wants to tell us a bit about Landhealer.
Okay, yeah. My story is a bit more complicated than that. I have an unfortunate surname that I've spent 30 years trying to distance myself from, hopefully for obvious reasons. It's nice to be recognised for what you do rather than what others do, so that's been part of my journey. I was interviewed a few months ago and someone said, who are your inspirations? And my inspirations are the people that work the land, those with mud on their boots and calluses on their hands, those that know it and are passionate about it, and see the ebb and flow of the seasons, whether that's the planting of the crops or whether that's the grazing of the livestock or whether that's the creation of biodiversity. And Landhealer is really a story of my journey and really a story of bringing a community of land owners, land occupiers, farmers, whether they're tenanted, smallholders, large estates, and bringing them and trying to give them hope and possibility and trying to actually connect them all together, because there's a lot of disjointed thinking out there on whether it's productivity, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's food security, and actually only collectively can we really make a difference. And what I found is that, I'm a Groundswell virgin, and this is just amazing today. The last 2 days have been amazing. I haven't gone to too many events, but what I have done is I've met people, I've talked to people, I've exchanged ideas, people that are passionate about what they do and how they're doing it, and learning by mistakes and knowledge exchange. Land Healers is trying to explain that actually we can all work collectively, we can work with each other, and we have a climate change, and we have climate change. We have to be resilient to that, and we need to ensure that we have food systems that are resilient to it. We know there's a biodiversity crisis, and in my 52 years, I've probably seen some of the greatest declines in farmland biodiversity. But there is hope. It's not doom and gloom. We have the possibility. We have the energy of the last 48 hours that demonstrates that we can make differences. And I think my story is about demonstrating what I've done with others, and I've been taking pictures of individuals because I'm not the land healer. You are the land healers. It's you out there that will make the difference. So that's my story. I'll stop.
I wanted to kick this off, Jake, with asking you about a quote. I think Jake's book came out of an incredible piece in The New Yorker where he was on the front cover with a long article by the brilliant Sam Knight, who said, quoting Julian Glover, "There's an element of Jake which looks like he could have taken up farming or heroin." And this might be the first farming book I've ever read, which is quite heavy on nightclubs. So can you talk us through how you went from kind of door bitch to the land?
So agriculture is really addictive, as I'm sure all of you will agree. I managed to sidestep the heroin. I don't think we've got enough time to explain how I got here, but when you're young and impressionable and you think the lights and the city is the place to go, and the early 80s or the mid 80s where the nightclub scene was pretty rocking, if I'm honest. So I left the comfort of a Suffolk cottage that I was living in with my parents, and I took up a position in a nightclub called the Limelight. And any of you of a certain age that might have lived in London in the mid-80s would have realized that this was the place to be. So dancing on glass tables with Tina Turner in stilettos, drinking vodka with Lemmy, trying to fend off Boy George when he was being rather amorous in a wrong way. So it's many experiences, but it wasn't. It was detrimental, and it really wasn't where I wanted to go. So I rang up a friend of mine called Charlie Burrell and said, "Any chance I could come down for the weekend?" And Charlie said, "Yeah, sure." So I came down in my black trench coat and my Spanish, hat, and I stayed there for 3 years. And Charlie educated me on managing estates and land and farming, and it was not the NEP that we all hear about today. It was a very different NEP castle. And Charlie was the instigator of the start of my passion for nature and wildlife and farming and food.
There must have been something in the water in the 80s, because I definitely grew up as an 80s kid with regularly spending time on the farm, but wanting to do anything I could that would get me to the city. Everything I saw in films or read about told me that the city was where people were important, where voices were worth listening to, where the clever people went. And I think one of the things which runs throughout both our books, and I really was a great lesson in humility for me when I landed in Suffolk by accident, was realizing what a load of rubbish that was. Some of the farmers I've met have been some of the greatest philosophers I've ever met. This type of farming that I have been learning about can teach us much more than about growing food, I think. And I think one of the things which this great swell of literature about farming hopes to do, I hope it achieves this, is to give voices to the people who are rarely listened to or given respect or credibility, especially those who've seen through the changes. I think they've got things to teach us that go way outside a field. And part of that, I suppose, is one of the taglines I wanted to talk about, this great idea that the further backwards you look, the further forwards you can see. And I think that too has been a big lesson in the learning that I've been doing, that none of this is new. And if we have the humility to look backwards.
So Sarah, but in your book you have conflict with your Uncle Charlie. So it's not.
I mean, everyone has conflict with my Uncle Charlie, but.
So it's not all plain sailing initially. Can you expand on that?
I think that I ended up in a position that lots of people who are wound up in the complexities of succession find themselves, where you have a generation that has been told that their job is productivity, feeding the world at all costs, and are cynical about the conflicting messages that are coming out about the ecological catastrophe. And you have another generation coming up, and that's what I was seeing a lot, and I think I probably fit into that, saying, but this is what the reports say about it. This is what the UN is saying about it. This is what all these big organizations are saying about it. And what I think has been lost in this debate is the sensitivity to that generation who were told that their job was to feed the world, and they were encouraged by their government, paid by their government, and encouraged by all those who said it was the right way of doing things, to farm a certain way. And then after 40-something years of doing that, to be told not only that they're not doing it right, but that they've caused real harm. And that removes, especially in the case where people don't own their own land, after 40 years of spending every day doing that, it removes everything, their legacy. So to be able to say, as I do know farmers have, Nick Padwick, who I think is sensibly gone, but he is one of the farmers who said to me, I've got 10 years left to make up for all that I think I've done wrong. It's a massive thing to say, and I think that we need to be a bit more empathetic about people who aren't quite in that place yet. But what I wanted to ask you as well, Jake, is you ended up in a place of huge history. I mean, you ended up in the part of the country that started the most recent agricultural revolution with Coke of Norfolk.
So I'm a particularly lucky individual. I've never planned my career. It's just evolved and changed. And I don't like to quote the Secretary of State too often, although he did get an amazing response today.
Yeah, he did.
That my career was an evolution, not a revolution. I didn't set my goals and where I wanted to do and what I wanted to be. But I'm very lucky to work on an amazing small landholding on the North Norfolk coast, which has an incredible history and is incredibly diverse and is rich in nature. And it is the home of the agricultural revolution 200 years ago, where the second Earl, I might be corrected by the members of the audience if I get some of these dates wrong, but the second Earl who got people together and had conversations about the improvement of agriculture and how to make sure that the food was sustainable and the soils were healthy and were well maintained, and ensuring that muck was kept on the farm, and there were short-term lays that were grazed by sheep, and bringing a mixed farming system into a farming system that was not producing sufficient food for a nation. And this whole agricultural revolution that happened 200 years ago effectively kick-started the Industrial Revolution because it provided food for people. And the fundamentally important thing about agriculture is it feeds people. So what I think is amazing about what is happening over the 5 years of 6 years of Groundswell is I feel like we're revisiting a revolution. We are going back to some of the old systems that were tried and tested, but we're using a modern context on how we apply them. So we're looking at data. Data is really important. Slightly frustrated where I don't think the Secretary of State today understood the importance of baselines and where we are and where we think our soils, because then we start to understand the improvements that we make. And everything that I describe in Land Healer is about how we have baselines and make improvements and learn from the past. I'm not reinventing the wheel, but I'm revisiting the wheel. And I'm not necessarily putting a steel wheel over it or a rubber tire over it, because I think we need to be more imaginative on how we approach agriculture and how we know we need to make more space for nature, and I know I'm probably slightly heavy on that side, but it can't be sidelined to the corners of field. It has to be a whole farm approach. So some of the examples that we've seen is where we apply a whole farm approach, actually we can increase biodiversity in the middles of the fields that we're producing food in. And that's really encouraging. And yeah, we make mistakes, and we've got to be honest about that. And we've got to tell people that didn't quite work, but we're trying something else. And that's the educational process. And that's what I find today and yesterday so invigorating, is people are being honest. People are being truthful with themselves and with others. And thereby creating collaborations that create solutions, because we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to be difficult. But I think we have a real positivity, and I don't want to mention Mr. M, but because I know Sarah had a rather difficult time with Mr. M not long ago.
Oh, I don't know. I think I did quite well, but yeah.
You did brilliantly. You smashed it, girl. But you can't. If you start to alienate a community, you can't bring them with you. And the importance of understanding, we know much of what is being said is right. But if we're saying that agriculture is the most destructive industry on the planet, we ain't going to bring agriculture with us. So the importance, I think, what my book and much of Sarah's book is agriculture being more responsive and progressive and working well to enable us to ensure that my children and their children actually live somewhere that is sustainable and has a future.
Yeah, exactly. And I because I straddle countryside and city, I have seen it and lived it from both sides. I've sat on the tube after Veganuary and seen adverts by massive companies flogging deep-fried soya, basically, with signs saying, "Don't be a carnivore," and the cowpat has hit the fan. And have seen messages from someone ordering a vegan meal on a short-haul flight, thinking that they're saving the world. When we're talking about bringing people over to a side that looks at a combination of both tech and old good stewardship, we've all got these insanely confused messages about what to do and what not to do. How are we going to be able to bring those in the middle who are thinking, I'm not sure what to believe, with us?
So where were you in February?
It's true. I wasn't on that tube, clearly.
I think there was an amazing cheese challenge.
Yeah,
All
right.
The cheese challenge man is here. So how do we bring people with us? So I think, first of all, we need to look at our own community. So I think I put agriculture in three compartments. We have progressive, forward-thinking, communicating agriculture, which is what I believe this is all about. We have the middle section of agriculture that is deeply confused and doesn't know which way to look. And then we have a part of agriculture that quite likes the previous system.
Go on. I know what you're going to say.
Hard-ass Taliban slash and burn farmers. Can you edit that?
They're not here. It's all right.
So, but we have that. We have an element of a community that actually quite likes the status quo. We're happy with it. Fertilizer, I can buy my fertilizer this. If I put so much on, I've got wheat at a certain price. I just carry on as normal. We can't continue like that. But I don't think this third needs to necessarily engage with that, because it's the middle ground that's important. and it's engaging with them and demonstrating those farmers and farm businesses, because once 2/3 of the industry is aligned and has a direction of travel, doesn't necessarily have a roadmap, but has a direction of what it wants to do, then the supply chain, which is probably the next most important bit, starts to follow suit, because they are the one. They have more at stake than we do. And I think, and then the supply chain, everything we heard about. I think it was Patrick Holden was talking about, or the weights of pigs, and then the size of the cutlets that have to sit on a shelf that's at a certain size. We have a whole food system that has been created to artificially produce food in a way that isn't natural. And it's only as the system, if the primary producers collaborate and have a direction of travel, I think that the food system will change as well. And then all of the conversations about health follows through. And the importance, I think, that government's role in this is about incentivizing the right ambitions that we're trying to put in place.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because both of our books look at the most recent history, how we got here. The need during the Second World War to go from a point where we were importing 75% of our food to a point where we were making 75% of our food in a relatively short period of time. And lots of people will say that's what helped the Allies win the war, was our ability to feed ourselves. It then carried on for a lot longer. And the position that we're in now is living with the legacy of that. There have been environmental measures in place in one form or another for 20 years. 30. The Agenda 2000 was the document that really kind of kicked it. But yes, there have been payments for environmental measures. Now, if you ask Tony Juniper or whoever was on the panel earlier, they will say it hasn't worked. So where do we get to where we're talking about a political framework and political incentives, and how much actually as farmers we need to say, forget it, we'll do it ourselves, and this is how?
So we had ESA, which was the first schemes brought out in the early 90s, and that was mainly in Norfolk. Not that I'm kind of akin to Norfolk, but Norfolk was one of the first with the Broadland ESA scheme. It was wonderfully simplistic. You had 3 tiers of ambition, whether that was just reducing fertilizer, eliminating fertilizer, or wetting up, and then we saw ELS. And the first day, we had countryside stewardship first time round, and that morphed into ELS. And ELS had a huge uptake by farmers, because you were going to pay farmers £30 a hectare on a range of measures that were considered good for the environment. But farmers had just been modulated £30 a hectare as of their direct support. So the reason there was such a huge uptake, it was because they just want to maintain the income. Listen, government, look what they're doing. They're following the money, because agriculture has always followed the money. The Secretary of State mentioned earlier about 40% uptake in countryside stewardship, because farmers are now knowing they're being modulated, so they're following the money. So we need government to actually look at what the industry does to implement. And I think we want to, I'm deeply frustrated with prescription, because what I do in Norfolk can't be replicated in Northumberland, Cumbria, or Cornwall. And we need the flexibility to adapt to what we think suits our farm. And I think we also understand that we need to work on a landscape scale. So some might think, I work on a landscape scale, but actually, if I look at, I think it's actually bigger than that. It's county, it's catchment, it's continent, because if we are, and then we need farmers. Farmers have the solutions. If they're given the appetite and they're given the strength and they're given the the incentive, and this doesn't necessarily need to be financial incentive, but given the courage and the backing from the public, from the people that they're feeding, because if I look at history where farmers have been vilified, The Killing of the Countryside by Graham Harvey, Silent Spring, some of these books were quite important books.
Very pivotal books, yeah.
But a lot of them were demonizing agriculture. And I think we have a moment in time, we have this snapshot in time to actually show people across the world the importance of agriculture. So 40% of habitable land is in agriculture globally. There are 570 agricultural businesses globally. 500 million of those farm businesses are less than 2 hectares, and 60% of those are vulnerable to climate change with not having an ability to produce food. So these are some of the real challenges we've got ahead of us, and how we, as living in a temperate climate, how we have the ability to produce food that might need to feed others. And I think I'm feeling quite confident. I'm feeling quite excited that actually we can do this. And I think listening to the stories in your book of Farmer Tom, Farmer Nick, wonderfully, we don't hear their surnames, but we all know who they are, really.
Well, I don't know you did. No, they were. I was proud, actually, that a lot of the farmers that I wrote about asked not to be anonymized. They asked for me to use their real names. Not all of them, but enough. And I think even in the 2 years that I've been researching and writing it, the needle has changed so far. When I was writing it and going to these farms where you have people, some of whom have been doing this kind of experimentation for 25 years, in the face of quite significant cynicism around them, I would be typing with the ghost of my grandfather kind of behind me, going, why are you writing about wildflowers? Why are weeds good, for God's sake? So but by the time I finished the book, it has this regenerative revolution, which I am insisting on calling it because I believe it, because I've seen it, had picked up such a lot of momentum that I would go to places where there would be people who looked deeply uncomfortable in Wellingtons and were never really that dirty, and they would be talking about soil. And I thought, why are you, hedge funder, talking about soil? Is that our way into this? Because is soil our way in? Because it's taken George Monbiot 37 years to catch up to it, which is pretty extraordinary for an ecologist, but there we are. He's now awake to the wonders of it. People were writing about Eve Balfour, who I write about in my book, who wrote The Living Soil back in 1943. And incidentally, gave a wonderful line about agriculture being the National Health Service because it was so closely linked, our health is so closely linked, 5 years before the formation of the NHS. We've talked about soil for 100 years, but it does seem that is potentially our way into the public's consciousness in terms of allowing farmers, for the first time in many decades, to become heroes.
So my frustration,
quite a long question.
My frustration is soil is really not sexy at all.
I so disagree.
I made mud patties when I was a child, but beyond that, so it's really difficult to try and engage. We can talk about worms and microsobial fungi.
Okay, let's do a pop quiz. Who here thinks soil is cool? You lose. You lose that.
No. Who here thinks soil is sexy?
You lose that too.
Anyway, so I just I had a ghostwriter because I have a day job, and I'm very conscious of that.
Let's not go there, shall we?
I'm also dyslexic.
Okay, fine. I didn't English
pick the sympathy card. It's always a good one. But my ghostwriter said, and so we talk about how we engage with people beyond our community, and view the British public as everyone you meet in a service station. And when you think about that, and think about each time M40, M25, M1, and you pull in to buy extortionately expensive fuel and extortionately expensive...
Go electric, Jake.
Don't even talk about my diesels. And actually, if you look at those people, it's amazing, actually. They're not the people that we associated with, and they're people that are just living their lives and carrying on. And they're the people we're trying to say soil's amazing and sexy. That's like pushing up a hill, I think.
I disagree. I think, and I spent 10 years representing people that society left behind. And I think we constantly underestimate people's capacity for wonder and capacity to have their imagination moved. And I think if you say to someone, a teaspoon of soil has got up to 1 billion microbes in it, it's alive, it changes. You can measure it now and measure it tomorrow, and you might get different results. It is the thing that creates the nutrition that we need. It has an entire telephone network going underneath it for meters and hundreds of meters. I mean, that will blow anyone's mind.
No, don't get me wrong. My fascination with the natural world is, and its complexity.
Okay.
So
we're not going to be taught around it.
I get all that, but for me, it's the it's untamed. Gaia, the world is a female. It's untamed, and we're never going to have control of it because.
Dang right.
Because climate change is going to demonstrate that it'll bite us in the arse if we don't look after it. So it's treat it well, and it will treat you kindly.
There's both of us have talked a lot in our books about real people with anecdotes of the challenges they've set themselves, what they've managed to overcome. I've got many farmers who I'm extremely fond of, but the final chapter in my book is about 2 farmers that have been in a kind of farm partnership, which I think actually probably helped them because they didn't feel such an island to be experimenting with all the things that they've been doing. They have been incredibly inspiring to me. Who, on your kind of farming journey, which has been far longer than mine, who's stuck out as someone that you think everyone should know about this person? They're extraordinary. They've been doing incredible things.
So for me, it's the people that work the land. So I've had a mixed career in land use. So I've done just about everything. But so there are individuals that stand out. There's the forester at Knepp Castle who said, when I said, "You're the head forester," he said, "No, I'm the woodman," because a woodman cares and looks after the forest, and he's not necessarily driven by timber production. It's the gamekeeper that was more fascinated by some of the songbirds rather than the pheasants that he was caring after, and actually knew about the importance of invertebrates and the importance of flowers that would provide food for a range of species, but also benefit his game birds. It's the Aboriginal. My 21st birthday was spent in the Western Pilbara, which is about 1,000 kilometres north of Perth, with an Aboriginal who taught me about how where the rains fell and how the soil transformed, having had its life reinvigorated, and all these flowers, and then suddenly biodiversity erupted in a kind of crescendo of when the rains arrived. So it's always been. It hasn't been the influencers. It hasn't been it's been the people that work the land have always been the ones that inspired me.
And do you think that this is kind of a self-serving question, but telling their stories hopefully will get that out there? Because my view is that for too long we've listened to people who haven't worked the land. And those who are coming up with policy, for example, George Eustace is a farmer. That's why he's been Oh, I don't know how you feel about that, but I'm good at it.
I think we need to hear, we really need the voices of those that work the land. We really need, I'm not an academic. I left school at 16. But actually, when I get an ecologist who's fresh out of, and they have this idea of this is how it works because the papers I've read say it is, we as land managers, as land healers, know that's not necessarily the case.
Can you give an example? Can you remember something that someone said to you and you think, that's just not right?
Okay, an example. So I arrived to I arrived to Holcombe 3.5 years ago, and the farm manager was having inherited agri-environment schemes. And one of them was a creation of a calcareous grassland. So we've lost 90% of our hay meadows in the UK through the drive for productivity. And this was a wonderful initiative where, there was seed was sourced within 10 kilometres of the site, and it was adjacent to a triple SI Iron Age hill fort next to a river valley, really very special place. But he was driven by a prescription from those that write the prescriptions that he should cut and remove every year, and he'd had to do that between the middle of July and the middle of August. And it was like creating a fake system because it was removing agriculture where we were trying to have totally an ecological focus and an ecological goal, whereas by removing agriculture. So when I turned up, I said, well, this is wrong. You're producing a load of forage, which isn't forage, which isn't edible, and actually you're just having to bale it and burn it. Actually, we've removed agriculture from it. So I had a conversation with the powers that be, Mr. TJ's friends and colleagues, Tony Juniper, that is. And I said, I think we need to change the way we're doing this because it's traditionally calcareous chalk grassland was always grazed in the winter. So I said, this is what I'm proposing to do, and I think you're just going to have to go with it. Anyway, so this site that was about 6 years old of a reversion from arable to calcareous grassland had the highest account of orchids of about 190. And we all know, regarding this very sexy soil and the importance of orchids as a demonstration of how important how the soil is starting to function. And we brought sheep into the equation, and we grazed them at the sort of tail end of or early autumn. Not necessarily a date. You can't farm by dates. You farm by instinct. And the sheep would graze, and we'd pull them off when they had done their job. We saw within 2.5 winter grazing seasons, we saw the orchid population go from 200 thereabout to thousands across the field because we had brought agriculture back into the system.
The white plague being helpful. Imagine what George would say.
What do they call it? What does he give some expression for sheep?
The woolly plague. Yeah.
The woolly pig. Okay.
There we are.
Anyway, we've talked rather a lot.
Yeah, we have. Well, I was going to say, we've got about 15 minutes left. I did suggest to Jake, I don't know if he's going to kill me for this, but that maybe you might like to hear a little reading or just go to questions.
Let's take a vote.
Hands up for a little reading, little bedtime story. Oh, yeah, I think that wins it. Have you got one? Do you want me to go first? You go first. Okay. I've timed this. It's exactly 5 minutes. Fear not. I am unsure what the long-term consequences of removing the subsidies that have supported food production for so long will be. Many are certain that removing subsidies means farms will fail. I should be clear that not everyone thinks this is a bad thing. While few will say it with the record button pressed, many know someone whose poor farming has been covered up by public money. Some tell me these farms should fail so they can be worked by new blood with open minds, for there are plenty who want to do so. But if the food these new farmers make is undercut by imported products made cheap because they have been produced without the same environmental and welfare standards, then this new generation of farmers will fail too. With the price of land always increasing, the ability of these new farmers to buy or rent old farms is limited. It seems therefore as likely that these old farms may be bought not by a new farmer, but by those who do not intend for it to be a farm at all. This is already happening. In 2020, the amount of farmland bought by non-farmers accounted for just under half of all farm sales. We are in a biodiversity and a climate crisis. Of that, there is no doubt. Farming has played its part in that. The consequences of this are now apparent. I have never heard the song of a turtle dove because their numbers have fallen by 97% in 50 years. I heard the call of a curlew and a lapwing for the first time when writing this book because curlew numbers have nearly halved in 25 years and lapwings dropped by 80% since 1960. My children have never heard the sound of a cuckoo, a song my grandmother would pull me outside to listen to, for she thought it the sound of spring beginning, because 65% of all cuckoos have been lost in my lifetime. I try not to think too much about what birds my children's children will no longer hear. But there are other crises too, of mental and physical health, housing and inequality, which can forecast a child's future before it's begun. And while our food may not be cheap, the cost of dealing with this cheapness is not. The price of food should have made hunger impossible, but it has not, because people's budgets have been decimated by reduced support and rising bills. The solutions, it seems, may not be new ones. They can be found in books published 100 years ago. If we connect food and health, both physical and mental, maybe governments might begin to see the benefit of properly funding the weekly shop. If we connect food and the environment, our labelling and prices might start to show the true climate and environmental cost of its production. If we connect food to community, maybe we will not just give food its true place and value, but see how all of us are connected to those who make it and begin to value them too. I have come to believe that farming can offer solutions to many of the problems we face. But, unexpectedly, I've also understood something else. Learning about farming taught me lessons about life applicable far beyond the field boundary. I learned about humility and patience and the unintended consequences that hubris can bring about. I learned about the need to find and trust your instincts. I experienced the power of mystery and awe in a time when both are often thought to be irrelevant. Finally, I came to understand that even if the 83% of our population who live in urban areas do not know it or feel it, all of us are connected to our farmers and them to us. They may represent just 1% of our workforce, but they look after 70% of our land. Their choices affect us all, whether we have clean air, clean water, rich wildlife, healthy soils in which to grow nutrient-rich food, habitats for the food chain we are part of, or whether our soils have the ability to store a pool of carbon 3 times larger than that which is in the atmosphere, an amount so vast it has the potential to cool our planet. Many have held on to a connection we have lost with the natural. As we navigate a lonely online future, some have learned lessons about life that even those who will never step into a food field may find valuable. Farmers can do this, we just need to enable them. They carry both our country's future and its history in their hands, and in doing so, they carry ours too.
Not sure how I follow that, but anyway. So, interestingly, Sarah's read the tail end, and I'm going to read the beginning.
It's very fitting to end on that.
Yellow, a flash. Quick, short wing beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Glide, dip, wing beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. and rise again. Another power glide. And into the hedge. It's gone. A male yellowhammer, no bigger than a sparrow, but instantly recognizable for its yellow crown. The hedge is high, 12 feet or more, where the land slopes downwards, and just a touch to the southwest on this patch of chalky soil. I'm sitting in my 4x4, where the land slopes away gently at the corner of Tinker's Hole and the 20 acres. Two of the fields at the heart of Great Farm. From this spot, I can see only fields and hedgerows and the wide Norfolk sky. The air is pleasantly warm and the field margins are filled with wildflowers. Tall, dark beacons of viper's bugloss with bright, bluey, spiky flowers stand proud on the undergrowth. And here and there are pale spires of wild mignonette, a delicate yellow plant used in ancient times to make dye, waved gently in the... I'm not used to this. Wave gently in the light breeze. Below them, in a tangle of foliage just a few inches high, the short, stumpier common mallow makes a show with its eye-catching fuchsia-pink petals. Mm-hmm. There are pure white oxeye daisies by their thousands, and bees, hoverflies, and dragonflies create a low, rumbling soundscape. On the patchy ground near the hedge line, I spot night-flowering catchfly, sometimes called cami clockle, a rare plant that flowers during the dark and releases a scent to attract moths. It's only in flower for a month or so, not very spectacular, but it has 5 tiny double-lobed petals that look like bunny ears. Here and there is a sense of abundance. The flowering plants have made a living carpet of colour, attracting a host of insects for birds to feast upon. This is the time of greatest variety, and where there's maximum food in the fields. That means it's also where most of the birds are nesting, laying and rearing their chicks. The track where I'm sitting is new. It has its role to play in the way the farm welcomes nature. The tram lines made by the wheels of farm tractors. A female grey partridge scurries ahead in a dead straight line on the scrubby ground. After a second or two, I see 5 tiny chicks emerge from the long grass at the base of the hedge and follow her in single file. They like to forage on insects on plants where the undergrowth isn't too thick, ducking into the crops or in the hedge line when she calls her alarm. On the far side of Tinker's Hole, I can see brown hares using the 13-hectare field as a giant boxing ring. 7 animals running back and forth on the open ground. They make short-lived pairs, circling and breaking apart as individual males seek to challenge one another and disrupt other courting couples. They dance and weave across the lower half of the field, ignoring me so long as I don't open the truck door and step out. High above it all, there is a female marsh harrier, gliding over the open ground, but the hares carry on. It's mating time, and very little will interrupt them. And the harrier, in spite of her impressive 4-foot wingspan, would be more than likely to take a leveret rather than a healthy adult hare anyway. Right now, my hedge is a safe place for the yellowhammer. I keep watching, and soon I see more of these tiny birds making their way in and out of the foliage. In the space of a couple of minutes, I count 7 or 8 males coming and going. One bird perches on the arching bough of a bramble frond that bounces gently like a rocking horse under its weight. Then comes the song. The distinctive call of the yellowhammer is famous, the rapid half-dozen cheeps, followed by the last drawn note that the countryman's sounds like a little bit of bread and no cheese. There are linnets, too, flying in groups where their call that is higher pitch. Chick, 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 chip, choo. And even smaller than the yellowhammer, when the simmer undulating flight, but easily singled out by their pale raspberry-tinged feathers, as if they've been supping from a jam jar. This is the time of year when every farm in the country should be at its best. The hedge has more growing to do, but this year it's putting its energy into producing berries. It will get bigger and bolder, and each successive growing season, and then it will reach its natural limit. Meanwhile, there's so much happening on the ground. Pink campion, muskmallow and shepherd's purse. There is a stand of tall maiden's tears, also known as bladder campion, the dainty fine petals emerging in its slack-like callus. Crossbills have been seen here. Their overlapping beaks, like scissors, have gone wrong, but designed perfectly for picking seeds out of the fine pine cones. The farm is buzzing and alive with a mass of colour and texture.
That is so beautiful. Please, can we come? Who wants to go to Hokum? Who wants Jake to do a tour of Hokum? We want to see it. I think there's a roving mic for whoever has a question. John. Don't forget you're in the book, John, before you say anything.
Thank you so much.
That'll be Farmer John then.
I'm so looking forward to reading both your books. Thank you so much. Really interesting presentation. I just want to agree, the ELS, and there was an OELS scheme as well, was a broad and shallow scheme, and there was a 70% uptake of it, which meant, actually, even though it's been sort of criticised because it was easy to get into, it meant that all our farms around our area, be it organic or non-organic, were joined up by all these amazing margins. And I think, actually, it did a huge amount for biodiversity. And I suppose the equivalent now is this the sustainable farming incentive, because it's non-competitive, you can get into it. And then after that, you've got these targeted schemes, which are really going to sort of be taken up by people like us who want to do it anyway. But the sustainable farming incentive, when you think of the £40 a hectare they're going to be getting for testing your soils, which you have to do if you're farm assured anyway, and it's going to pay about half of the seed cost for putting in your green manures. I just cannot understand how that's going to incentivize anybody who isn't doing it like me, because I'm just going to claim it because it's going to pay for half my seed cost. But when you drive from Bury St Edmunds to Royston, there is a massive amount of East Anglia which is not in regenerative agriculture. So my question is, actually, how do we get that vast amount of land that actually isn't regenerating soils, isn't recovering nature, how do we get them engaged?
Okay, so regarding payment rates and new schemes coming forward, so Health and Harmony paper, where British Agriculture was asked the question, how long do you want the transition period to be following exiting the CAP? And we all voted for a 7-year transition. So that's quite painful. And in that transition, while we have Pillar 1, direct support, Pillar 2, stewardship, and as we're modulated, that money has to move across into SFI, and that's why the payment rates are quite low. And that's frustrating in itself, because it doesn't incentivize you, it doesn't engage you. And, speaking to Minister Prentice, Agriculture Minister Prentice earlier today, where they're only she's expecting, she would be happy with a 10% uptake of SFI. And she's probably going to get about that. And that's probably going to be people that are already doing it already. So how do we incentivize? How do we, so I was asked the question yesterday at a session, what would I give the progression for producing nature in farmland in UK out of 1 out of 10? And I gave it a 5, because actually as I drove from Norfolk through Cambridge and Hertfordshire or wherever I've come, I just follow a sat-nav, so I don't really know where I'm going. And it was quite depressing. Yeah, occasionally I see snippets. You just glimpse something that you go, that's working, because we all roadside farm, don't we, John? So we do. So how do we incentivize? It's about income, and I'm of the firm belief that the 4.2 billion that British Ag gets in the current current political cycle, where they've said they will maintain that income, it needs to be more than that, because we need to really value sustainable, healthy agriculture that produces food, nutritious, and maintains soils for resilience. We have to prepare ourselves to be resilient against climate change. All of you who farm in the UK will have experienced drought and flood and disease thresholds. And actually, we need to start preparing ourselves, and that's through incentives. So it's not perfect, but we're at this wonderful moment in time. Oh, time's up. We're at this wonderful moment in time where we have the opportunity to change and influence others.
And can I very quickly chase that up with, yes, I agree, except for I'm not entirely sure that given the combination of massive impacts on climate change together with a very rapid loss of subsidy, that many people are going to be able to afford to do business as usual. Because although there are still definitely some farmers still making money, I know some large-scale arable farmers making money on grade 1 land, that's not going to be the case for the vast majority. Couple that with floods, droughts, completely unpredictable weather. And I'm not entirely sure that without that big fat check every December, many people are going to be able to carry on in exactly the same way. If you add to that a layer, not necessarily of public money, because I'm not entirely sure that that's ever going to be enough or work, but the private finance in terms of natural capital payments, and I know it's deeply problematic and flawed, and we need to look at all sorts of regulation that goes with it. But if we allow what Minette Batters talks about as a kind of trillions of dollars swirling around above our heads and find a way to get it to farmers to make up for the subsidy payments, then money does talk. And the thing is, someone like Martin Lyons is very clear about this. You talk with money at the beginning, and then once that first change has happened, it becomes about more than money, because farmers start to see it, to see the change up close, and then they begin to transform their own way of seeing and looking. And when I sat next to a guy in his 70s the other day who was very hacked off with his son, who wanted to plant wildflowers where there had been weeds. And he felt, that's not fair. He wasn't hacked off. He was confused and said, I think it's morally wrong. I think it's morally wrong to put wildflowers where I should be growing wheat. And I said to him, it's not just because they look pretty. If you grow wildflowers up every 4th tramline, your yield either side of it, according to Martin Lyons' research, will improve by 25%. If you bring beneficials in, you're going to eliminate your insecticide use. It's not just looking pretty. It works as a whole. So I think there's going to be a 2 carrot and stick that's going to make it change. I also do that drive from London to Suffolk a lot. And what I have noticed is that you used to be able to do it without seeing an animal, ever. And now I go, sheep, sheep. People are starting to realize that, as we do on our arable farm, that we can integrate livestock and go back to a return mix system, and it will help our pocket as well as the wider ecology. I'm sorry, guys, time's up. But we'll be
okay, right. But lasting comment, you're all deeply rooted and all of you are land healers.
Yay! On brand, Jake, on brand.